You know what they say about the universe having a sense of humor? Well, whoever they are, they clearly never had to deal with the Zephyrian hegemony showing up at Earth's doorstep like the galaxy's most unwelcome door-to-door salesman. Except instead of trying to sell you overpriced vacuum cleaners, they wanted to sell humanity on the charming idea of becoming their latest conquered species. It was a Tuesday because of course it was. The universe apparently has a standing appointment with irony every Tuesday at 3:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Dr. Oliver Hartwell was having what he generously called a career crisis, and what everyone else called that thing where you realize your PhD in xenolinguistics is about as useful as a chocolate teapot when actual aliens show up. He'd spent the better part of 15 years studying theoretical alien languages, writing papers with titles like Hypothetical Grammatical Structures in Non-Terrestrial Communication Systems, and generally being the kind of academic who got invited to exactly 0 parties. Now, as he stood in the hastily converted conference room at the United Nations building, staring at a holographic display showing roughly 300 Zephyrian dreadnoughts positioned around Earth like particularly aggressive Christmas ornaments, he was starting to think maybe his mother had been right about law school. "So," said Admiral Rebecca Cruz, her voice carrying the kind of calm that only came from years of military training or really excellent medication. "Let me get this straight. They want us to surrender unconditionally, accept integration into their empire, and in exchange, they promise not to turn our planet into what they so poetically describe as a glowing cinder of regret." "That's about the size of it," replied Dr. Hartwell, adjusting his glasses in that nervous way academics do when they're about to deliver bad news. "Although I should mention that the translation might be slightly off. It could also mean sparkling ember of disappointment. Zephyrian emotional vocabulary is surprisingly nuanced when it comes to planetary destruction." The room fell silent except for the gentle hum of electronics and the distant sound of what Oliver was pretty sure was someone crying in the hallway. He couldn't blame them. The Zephyrians had given humanity exactly 72 hours to surrender, and they were now down to about 68 hours and 37 minutes. Not that anyone was counting. Actually, everyone was counting. There were literally countdown timers on every news channel, complete with ominous music and graphics packages that looked like they'd been designed by someone with serious anger management issues. "Dr. Hartwell," said Secretary General Yamamoto, her voice cutting through his mental spiral, "you've been studying their language for the past 6 weeks since first contact. Is there anything at all in their communications that might suggest a way out of this?" Oliver looked around the room at the collection of world leaders, military officials, and experts who were all staring at him like he was their last hope. Which frankly was terrifying, because Oliver's last great achievement had been successfully programming his coffee maker to start brewing at 6:45 a.m. instead of 6:30. The coffee maker had subsequently broken down 3 days later, possibly from the strain. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "there is one thing. It's probably nothing, but..." Admiral Cruz prompted, leaning forward with the kind of intensity usually reserved for people about to interrogate enemy spies or select lottery numbers. "They keep mentioning something called the ancient precedents. Every official communication references compliance with ancient precedents, adherence to ancient precedents, blah blah ancient precedents. It's like they're really concerned about following some kind of old rules." President Williams, who had been unusually quiet for the past hour, suddenly sat up straighter. "What kind of old rules?" "That's just it," Oliver said, spreading his hands helplessly. "I have no idea. It could be religious, legal, cultural. Hell, it could be the galaxy's most serious homeowners association for all I know. But whatever these ancient precedents are, the Zephyrians seem to take them very seriously." Chapter 2. When in doubt, ask the space lawyers. The thing about desperate situations is that they make people do desperate things. Like, for instance, wake up every xenoarchaeologist, xenolegal expert, and xeno-whatever the hell else ologist on the planet at 2 in the morning and demand they solve an interstellar crisis before breakfast. Dr. Priya Mehta had been dreaming about discovering a perfectly preserved alien library when her phone started making the kind of noise usually reserved for nuclear emergencies or particularly aggressive roosters. As the world's leading expert in what she liked to call alien paperwork, officially xenolegal archaeology, but she'd found that alien paperwork got more laughs at faculty mixers. She was used to being called at odd hours by graduate students who'd accidentally translated peace treaty as dinner recipe. This was different. "Dr. Mehta," came Oliver's voice through the phone, carrying the kind of manic energy that suggested either too much caffeine or impending apocalypse. "How fast can you get to New York?" "I'm in Mumbai, Oliver." It's 2:30 in the morning, and I'm fairly certain the laws of physics still apply to commercial aviation. Right, about that. How do you feel about military transport? 3 hours later, Priya found herself in what she was generously calling an aircraft, though it seemed to share more DNA with a particularly aggressive rocket than anything designed for human comfort. The pilot, a cheerful woman who introduced herself as Captain Fletcher, had assured her that they'd reach New York in record time, which turned out to be both accurate and terrifying. "So," Priya said to Oliver as they huddled in the UN's newly christened Crisis Management Center, formerly the break room, though someone had optimistically removed the microwave. "You're telling me that our potential salvation lies in understanding alien bureaucracy?" "I prefer to think of it as interstellar administrative law," Oliver replied, gesturing at the screens full of Zephyrian text that covered every available surface. "Look at this. Every single communication, every ultimatum, every threat, they all reference these ancient precedents. It's like they're operating under some kind of legal framework that's older than human civilization." Priya studied the text, her eyes moving across the alien script with practiced ease. She'd spent the better part of a decade developing translation protocols for theoretical alien legal systems, working under the assumption that any species advanced enough for interstellar travel would probably have lawyers. It had seemed like a reasonable bet at the time. "Interesting," she murmured, pulling up additional text on her tablet. "See this phrase here? In accordance with the ancient precedents as established in the Third Galactic Cycle." That's not just legal language, Oliver. That's someone citing case law. Case law? Think of it as judicial precedent. When courts make decisions, those decisions become references for future cases. The Zephyrians aren't just following old rules, they're following old court decisions. Admiral Cruz, who had been monitoring their conversation with the intensity of someone trying to understand quantum physics through interpretive dance, leaned over. "Are you saying these aliens have lawyers?" "Admiral," Priya said with the patient tone of someone explaining fire safety to toddlers, "every sufficiently advanced civilization has lawyers. It's like entropy, but worse. So we're looking for alien legal precedents?" "Not just alien," Oliver interrupted, his excitement growing. "Look at this." He pulled up another screen, pointing at a section of text that seemed to glow with importance. "They keep referencing something called the Terran exemption protocols and Sol system jurisdictional considerations. They're not just following general galactic law, they're following laws that specifically mention Earth." The room went very quiet. "I'm sorry," said Secretary General Yamamoto slowly. "Did you just say they're following laws about us? Laws that we didn't know existed?" "Laws that we didn't write," Priya added, her mind racing. "Which means someone else wrote laws about us. Someone wrote laws about humanity before we even knew there were other species out there. That's..." Admiral Cruz paused, apparently searching for the right word. "That's either really good news or absolutely terrifying news." "Why not both?" Oliver said cheerfully. "I find that most alien-related discoveries fall into the category of fascinating and horrifying." Chapter 3: The Galaxy's Most Boring Database. If there's one thing that unites all sentient species across the galaxy, it's apparently the ability to create mind-numbingly complex bureaucratic systems. The Galactic Legal Database, as Oliver and Priya discovered over the next 12 hours, made the Earth's various legal systems look like elegantly simple nursery rhymes. "Right," said Priya, rubbing her eyes after 6 straight hours of scrolling through what appeared to be the galaxy's most comprehensive collection of interstellar parking tickets and property disputes. "So far, I've found 17 different cases involving species that tried to conquer Earth, 12 cases involving species that tried to colonize Earth, and one absolutely baffling case about someone trying to use Earth as collateral in a poker game." "Don't forget the case about the moon," Oliver added, not looking up from his own screen. "Apparently there was a 300-year legal battle over whether our moon counted as a natural satellite or an artificial defense installation." "How is that even a question?" "Apparently, some species tried to claim that any celestial body that's perfectly sized to create total solar eclipses must be artificially constructed. The case went all the way to the Galactic Supreme Court. And? Natural satellite, but only by a margin of 3 votes. There was a very strongly worded dissenting opinion about the mathematical improbability of the whole situation. Admiral Cruz, who had been surviving on military-grade stimulants and what appeared to be pure determination, looked up from her communication console. "People, we've got less than 40 hours before these Zephyrians start their integration process. Please tell me you found something more useful than moon-related litigation." Actually, Priya said, her voice taking on the tone of someone who'd just found something interesting. I think I might have. Oliver, pull up case reference Galactic Standard 2847 Sol Tertiary. Oliver's fingers flew across the keyboard, and a new document appeared on the main screen. It was written in multiple languages, including what looked suspiciously like ancient Latin. Oh, said Oliver faintly. Oh my. Oh my good, or oh my, we're all going to die? Asked Captain Fletcher, who had been serving as their technical support ever since her transport duties had ended. Oh my, someone's been playing a very long game, Priya replied, scrolling through the document. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Treaty of Galactic Commerce and Territorial Sovereignty, signed approximately 3,000 years ago between the Roman Empire and something called the Confederation of Sentient Systems. The silence in the room was profound. I'm sorry, said Secretary General Yamamoto. Did you just say the Roman Empire? The Roman Empire, Priya confirmed, as in togas, gladiators, and et tu, brute. Someone apparently made contact with ancient Rome and negotiated a treaty that's still legally binding. That's impossible, Admiral Cruz said automatically. Admiral, 6 months ago you would have said alien invasions were impossible, Oliver pointed out. I'm starting to think our definition of impossible might need some updating. Priya continued reading, her excitement growing with each paragraph. According to this, Earth, specifically referred to as Sol Tertiary or Terra, was granted special status as a protected development zone under the Galactic Commerce Code. Any attempt to invade, colonize, or otherwise interfere with Terra without following proper legal procedures is considered a violation of galactic law. And the proper legal procedures are? That's the beautiful part, Priya said, grinning for the first time in days. According to this treaty, any species that wants to claim Terra must first prove their right to conquest through traditional trial by combat, as witnessed by representatives of the original signatory powers. Trial by combat? Captain Fletcher perked up. Like sword fighting? Not exactly, Oliver said, reading over Priya's shoulder. According to the fine print, traditional trial by combat in this context means competitive demonstration of species-specific excellence as judged by neutral arbitrators according to the customs of the challenged party. Which means, Priya said, her smile growing wider, that if the Zephyrians want to legally conquer Earth, they have to beat us at our own game, whatever game we choose. Chapter 4. The fine print is always in Latin. The next 6 hours were a blur of frantic research, increasingly creative interpretation of ancient legal documents, and what Oliver was pretty sure was the world's first case of interstellar law-related hysteria. The good news was that they'd found a potential way out of humanity's current predicament. The bad news was that it involved trusting a 3,000-year-old legal document written by Romans who thought lead made excellent plumbing material. Okay, said Dr. Mehta, addressing the hastily assembled emergency session of world leaders via video conference. Let me make sure everyone understands the situation. 3,000 years ago, representatives of the Roman Empire apparently negotiated a treaty with an alien confederation that included provisions for Earth's protection under galactic law. President Chen of the Pacific Federation raised her hand. How exactly did ancient Romans communicate with aliens? That's an excellent question that I'm choosing to ignore for the moment, Priya replied diplomatically. The important thing is that the treaty exists. It's legally binding under current galactic law, and it provides us with a way to avoid immediate conquest. Through trial by combat, added Admiral Cruz, who was looking simultaneously hopeful and deeply skeptical. Through competitive demonstration of species-specific excellence, Oliver corrected. It's more like extreme cultural exchange. The challenging species has to prove they're superior to humanity in some human-chosen activity. What kind of activity? Asked President Williams. That's where it gets interesting, Priya said, pulling up another section of the treaty. The challenge party, that's us, gets to choose the specific competition, as long as it represents the highest achievements of their civilization. The only restrictions are that it has to be something that can be objectively judged. Both species have to be capable of participating, and it has to be conducted within 96 standard galactic hours. 4 days, Oliver translated. We have 4 days to choose a competition, get the Zephyrians to agree to it, and then beat them at whatever we pick. And if we lose? If we lose, they get to conquer us, but they have to do it according to galactic law, which includes various protections for conquered species. No planetary destruction, no mass extinction, and they have to preserve our culture for historical purposes. And if we win? If we win, Priya said, consulting the document again. They have to leave and can't attempt conquest again for, let me see, 50 standard galactic years. How long is that in Earth years? Oliver did some quick calculations. About 73 years, give or take. The video conference erupted in excited chatter. 73 years was essentially a lifetime, long enough to develop better technology, make more alien friends, or possibly figure out how to move the entire planet to a less popular neighborhood of the galaxy. So, said Secretary General Yamamoto, the question becomes, what are we better at than a technologically advanced alien species? The room fell silent as everyone contemplated this question. The Zephyrians had faster-than-light travel, energy weapons, and the ability to casually position 300 warships around a planet. What exactly were humans supposed to be better at? Well, Oliver said tentatively, we could challenge them to a war. We'd lose, Admiral Cruz pointed out. Chess? They might be better at strategy games. Mathematics? They built those ships somehow. Art? How would you judge that objectively? The suggestions continued for another hour, each one seeming less viable than the last. How do you compete with a species that's mastered interstellar travel, when your own species still can't agree on whether pineapple belongs on pizza? Finally, Captain Fletcher, who had been quietly listening to the increasingly desperate brainstorming session, cleared her throat. What about bureaucracy? She said. Everyone turned to look at her. I'm serious, she continued. Think about it. We've got 3,000 years of human legal evolution since this treaty was signed. Romans, medieval law, common law, civil law, international law, maritime law, tax codes, environmental regulations, building permits, parking regulations, homeowner association bylaws. We've turned bureaucracy into an art form. You want to challenge them to paperwork? President Chen asked. Not just paperwork, Captain Fletcher said, warming to her theme. Legal procedure, bureaucratic navigation, administrative excellence. Let's see how these aliens handle a species that invented the IRS. Chapter 5. The Art of War, Forms and Procedures. The thing about brilliant ideas is that they often sound completely insane when you say them out loud. Challenging an advanced alien civilization to a bureaucracy competition was definitely in that category, falling somewhere between stroke of genius and cry for help. Let me get this straight, said the Zephyrian High Commander Vexthara through the translation system, her voice carrying what Oliver was learning to recognize as alien skepticism. You wish to engage in traditional trial by combat through administrative procedures? That's correct, replied Priya, who had somehow become humanity's official representative in this matter. Specifically, we propose a competition to demonstrate superior mastery of complex bureaucratic processes under time pressure. The holographic display showed Commander Vexthara in all her 8-foot-tall, crystalline carapaced glory. Her species had evolved from something that looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a very angry piece of modern art, and she moved with the kind of fluid grace that suggested she could probably tear a human in half without breaking whatever aliens had instead of a sweat. This is... She paused, apparently consulting with someone off-screen. An unusual request, but not illegal under the terms of the Treaty of Galactic Commerce and Territorial Sovereignty, Oliver added helpfully. We've checked. You have indeed checked, Vexthara admitted, and Oliver could swear he detected a note of grudging respect in her translated voice. Your research into the ancient precedents has been thorough. We're very good at research, Priya said. It's one of our things. Very well. What exactly would this bureaucratic competition entail? This was the moment they'd all been preparing for. Priya took a deep breath and launched into the proposal that had taken the combined efforts of Earth's best lawyers, administrators, and people who dealt with government paperwork professionally. The competition will consist of 3 phases, she began. First, both teams will be given identical complex legal scenarios, requiring navigation of multiple regulatory frameworks simultaneously. Second, teams must successfully process a series of administrative requests under realistic time constraints, while maintaining full compliance with all applicable procedures. Third, teams must design and implement a functional bureaucratic system capable of handling a specific governmental task from start to finish. Each phase will be judged by a panel of neutral arbitrators on accuracy, efficiency, and adherence to proper procedures, Oliver added. The team with the highest combined score wins. Commander Vexthara was quiet for a long moment. And you believe humans will excel at this administrative competition? Commander, Priya said with the confidence of someone who had once successfully applied for a research permit in 3 different countries simultaneously. My species invented the concept of requiring a permit to get a permit. We have government agencies whose entire purpose is to oversee other government agencies. We created tax codes so complex that we have an entire industry devoted to helping people figure out how much money they owe their own government. We once had a war that lasted over 100 years partly because of a dispute over administrative procedures, Oliver added cheerfully. The 100 Years' War had several brief periods of peace that were broken specifically because someone filled out the wrong paperwork. I see, said Vexthara, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to see. Oh, and Commander? Priya smiled sweetly. Since this is our choice of competition, we get to provide the bureaucratic frameworks that both teams will use. The silence from the Zephyrian ship was profound. Chapter 6. When aliens meet the DMV preparing for an interstellar bureaucracy competition turned out to be exactly as surreal as it sounded. Within 12 hours of the Zephyrians' grudging acceptance of the terms, the United Nations building had been transformed into what looked like the world's most important office space, complete with filing cabinets, multiple computer terminals, and enough forms to deforest a small moon. Right, said Oliver, addressing the assembled team of humans who would be competing alongside him and Priya. Let me introduce everyone. This is Linda Martinez, who holds the world record for fastest processing of immigration paperwork. David Kim, who successfully navigated the Byzantine permit requirements for opening a small restaurant in New York City. And Professor Janet Williams, who wrote her doctoral thesis on comparative analysis of tax codes from 12 different countries. And our secret weapon, Priya added, gesturing to a mild-mannered woman in her 50s. Margaret Foster, who spent 30 years working for the Internal Revenue Service and has personally audited over 3,000 tax returns. Margaret smiled pleasantly. I once made a drug dealer cry just by explaining Schedule K1 forms. That's actually terrifying, admitted Captain Fletcher, who was serving as their technical coordinator. That's the idea, Priya replied. If we're going to beat the Zephyrians at bureaucracy, we need to bring our A game. And in the world of administrative procedures, Margaret is basically the final boss. The Zephyrian team, when they arrived via shuttlecraft, was an impressive sight. 5 tall, crystalline beings in matching uniforms, each carrying what appeared to be some kind of advanced computing device that probably had more processing power than Earth's entire internet. Commander Vexthara introduced her team with military precision. Combat Administrator Zixkar, our logistics specialist. Data Coordinator Yextheta, responsible for information management. Compliance Officer Nexvara, expert in regulatory frameworks. Protocol Specialist Kextonis, trained in procedural efficiency. And Senior Bureaucrat Texmanar, who oversees administrative functions for 17 star systems. 17 star systems? Oliver whispered to Priya. They brought someone who does paperwork for 17 star systems? Don't panic, Priya whispered back. Remember, they might be efficient, but they've never dealt with Earth bureaucracy. We have home field advantage. The competition was overseen by a panel of neutral arbitrators from 3 different species, all of whom looked like they were already regretting their decision to volunteer for this duty. The head arbitrator, a being that resembled a cross between an octopus and a computer terminal, explained the rules one final time. Phase 1, it announced through the universal translator, will test your ability to navigate complex regulatory requirements. Each team must successfully complete a series of administrative tasks within the provided bureaucratic framework. You will be judged on accuracy, completeness, and adherence to proper procedures. What kind of tasks? Asked Combat Administrator Zixkar. Oliver and Priya exchanged glances. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. Each team must successfully apply for a small business license in the city of New York, Priya announced, including all required permits, inspections, and regulatory compliance documentation. The silence from the Zephyrian team was deafening. Additionally, Oliver continued, you must file a tax return for a small business with employees in multiple states, including calculation of payroll taxes, sales taxes, and federal income tax obligations. Senior bureaucrat Texmanar made a noise that the translator rendered as confused inquiry. Finally, Margaret Foster said, with the serene smile of someone about to deploy a tactical nuclear warhead, you must successfully apply for a permit to hold a public event in a city park, including coordination with multiple city agencies, environmental impact assessment, and compliance with noise ordinances. The head arbitrator looked between the 2 teams. Are these typical administrative tasks for your species? Oh yes, said David Kim cheerfully. I had to do all of this just to open a small restaurant. It only took me 6 months. 6 months? Texmanar's voice carried what the translator labeled as existential horror. That's if everything goes smoothly, Linda Martinez added helpfully. If you make any mistakes on the paperwork, you have to start over. Sometimes multiple times. Shall we begin? Asked the head arbitrator, though it sounded like it was hoping someone would say no. Chapter 7. The Forms Must Flow. What followed was perhaps the most bizarre spectacle in the history of human-alien relations. Watching advanced beings from across the galaxy try to figure out why a small business license application required 17 different forms, each of which referenced other forms, some of which didn't actually exist anymore but were still mentioned in the requirements. "Excuse me," said Protocol Specialist Kextonis, raising what appeared to be their hand. Form 27B requires information from Form 15C, but Form 15C states that it can only be completed after receiving approval from Form 27B. Is this a translation error? No, replied David Kim, who was working through his own stack of paperwork with practiced ease. That's a circular dependency. You have to submit both forms simultaneously with a waiver explaining the circular dependency which requires Form 44A. Where do we obtain Form 44A? You have to request it from the Department of Administrative Affairs, but they only process requests on Tuesdays, and only if you've already filed Form 12E declaring your intent to request forms. Kextonis stared at the paperwork for a long moment. This seems inefficient. Welcome to Earth, Margaret Foster said pleasantly, not looking up from her tax calculations. You should see what it's like to get a driver's license. Meanwhile, the human team was moving through the bureaucratic maze with the fluid grace of people who had spent their entire adult lives dealing with government paperwork. Oliver was cross-referencing zoning regulations with health department requirements, while simultaneously checking whether the business name they'd chosen conflicted with any existing trademarks. Priya was calculating employee tax withholdings for 3 different states while keeping track of which forms needed to be filed at the federal level versus the state level. How are you doing that? Asked Data Coordinator Yex Theta, watching in apparent fascination as Linda processed what appeared to be a dozen different permit applications simultaneously. Years of practice, Linda replied, stamping a form with satisfaction. The trick is to fill out everything in triplicate first, then figure out which offices actually need which copies. Most agencies will accept extra copies, but they'll reject your application if you don't have enough copies. But the requirements only specify. The requirements are guidelines, interrupted Professor Williams, who was deep in the maze of multi-state tax obligations. The real requirements are based on precedent, interpretation, and the personal preferences of whoever processes your paperwork. Sometimes you get lucky and they tell you what they actually want. Sometimes you have to figure it out by trial and error. Trial and error? For official government procedures? Oh, you sweet summer alien, Margaret Foster said, patting Yexatheta gently on what might have been their shoulder. Government procedures aren't designed to be understood. They're designed to make sure that only people who really, really want something are willing to go through the process of getting it. By hour 3 of Phase 1, it was becoming clear that while the Zephyrians were intellectually capable of understanding human bureaucracy, they were psychologically unprepared for it. These were beings from a civilization that had mastered faster-than-light travel, energy weapons, and galactic commerce, but they had apparently done so using logical, efficient systems where forms served actual purposes and procedures were designed to facilitate rather than obstruct. Combat Administrator Zixkar had been staring at a single tax form for 45 minutes, apparently unable to comprehend why Line 23 required information that could only be calculated after completing Line 47, which in turn required information from Line 23. This is impossible, Zixkar finally declared. The form contradicts itself. That's because you're supposed to use the supplemental worksheet, explained Professor Williams helpfully. It's in Publication 523A, which you can download from the government website if you know which department maintains it. Which department maintains it? That depends on whether your business is classified as retail, service, manufacturing, or other. But you can't determine the classification until you complete Form 8832, which requires information from your tax return. But we cannot complete the tax return without the classification. Exactly. Williams beamed like a professor whose student had finally grasped a difficult concept. That's why you file for an extension while you sort it out. It only costs $50 and gives you an extra 6 months. The head arbitrator made a noise that didn't translate well, but sounded distinctly like someone reconsidering their life choices. Chapter 8. Advanced Bureaucratic Warfare. Phase 2 of the competition involved what Priya had optimistically called realistic administrative scenarios under time pressure. In practice, this meant simulating a day at a typical government office, complete with clients who had incomplete paperwork, conflicting requirements from different departments, and the occasional person who just wanted to complain about something completely unrelated. Your task, explained Oliver to both teams, is to process 25 different administrative requests within a 4-hour time limit while maintaining full compliance with all applicable procedures and providing appropriate customer service. The Zephyrian team, still reeling from their encounter with Earth's small business licensing requirements, approached this challenge with the kind of methodical precision that had probably served them well in conquering other planets. They organized their workspace efficiently, divided the requests logically among team members, and began processing them with military-like coordination. This lasted approximately 7 minutes. "Excuse me," said the first simulated client, played by a retired government employee who had volunteered for the role with suspicious enthusiasm. "I need to renew my driver's license, but I lost my birth certificate, and I need the license to get a copy of my birth certificate from the Department of Records, but the Department of Records requires a valid ID to get a copy of my birth certificate." Senior bureaucrat Texmanar, who had been assigned to handle this request, paused for a moment. "This creates a logical paradox." "Yes," agreed the client cheerfully. "That's why I'm here. My cousin's wife's sister had the same problem, and she said you people could sort it out." What is the correct procedure for resolving this paradox?" "That's your job to figure out," the client replied helpfully. "I just know I need my license renewed by Friday, or my car insurance will lapse, and then I'll have to file Form SR-22, which is a whole other nightmare." Meanwhile, the human team was dealing with their own set of impossible requests with the kind of calm efficiency that comes from years of experience with impossible requests. "Ma'am," Margaret Foster was saying to another simulated client, "I understand that you need a permit to keep chickens in your backyard, but the agricultural department says you need a zoning variance. The zoning department says you need an environmental impact assessment, and the environmental department says you need approval from the agricultural department. So what do I do?" "You file a triple agency coordination request with the mayor's office," Margaret replied without missing a beat. "Attach copies of all 3 denials, include a $200 processing fee, and wait 6 to 8 weeks for them to schedule a hearing where all 3 departments can argue about whose jurisdiction it actually falls under. And then they'll probably tell you to file a triple agency coordination request." The client looked confused. "But The second request is different because it includes the documentation from the first request," Margaret explained patiently. "It's a completely separate process." Meanwhile, Professor Williams was dealing with a small business owner who needed to calculate taxes for a business that operated in 3 states, 2 of which had reciprocity agreements that affected how employee withholdings were calculated, but only for certain types of employees, on certain days of the week, during specific months of the year. "So," Williams said, consulting a stack of tax code references that was roughly the size of a phone book, "your situation falls under Section 142G, subsection 7, unless your business is classified as seasonal entertainment, in which case it's Section 298F, subsection 12, but only if your total payroll exceeds $50,000, which triggers Section 847A, subsection 2, unless you filed Form XC23 before the end of the previous tax year." "Did I file Form XC23? "That depends. Did you intend to classify your business as seasonal entertainment?" "I don't know." "What qualifies as seasonal entertainment?" "That's defined in Publication 472B, which references the definitions in Publication 831A, which was superseded by Publication 831C, except for businesses that were already using the old definitions under grandfather clause provisions." The business owner stared at her for a moment. "I just want to pay my taxes." "I know," Williams said sympathetically. "Nobody starts out wanting to become a tax expert. It just happens gradually, like Stockholm Syndrome, but with more math." By the end of Phase 2, the Zephyrian team looked like they had been through a war, which in a sense they had. A war against the fundamental concepts of logic, efficiency, and sanity. "I do not understand," declared Commander Vexthara during the brief recess between phases. "How does your civilization function with such inefficient systems?" "Very slowly," Oliver replied honestly, "but we've had a lot of practice." Chapter 9. The Final Form. Phase 3 was where Priya had decided to show no mercy whatsoever. The task was simple in concept. Design and implement a functional bureaucratic system capable of handling a specific governmental task from start to finish. Your assignment, she announced to both teams, is to create a complete administrative framework for processing applications for a new type of business permit. You must design all necessary forms, establish review procedures, create an appeals process, implement quality control measures, and ensure compliance with existing regulatory frameworks. How complex should this system be? Asked Compliance Officer Nexavara, who was beginning to sound like someone who was reconsidering their career choices. Margaret Foster smiled. Complex enough to handle real-world scenarios. Your system must be able to process applications for businesses that operate in multiple jurisdictions, have seasonal variations in their operations, employ both full-time and part-time workers, serve both residential and commercial customers, and may or may not fall under various environmental, health, and safety regulations depending on circumstances. Additionally, added David Kim, your system must include provisions for handling incomplete applications, conflicting information, requests for expedited processing, appeals and disputes, interagency coordination, and changes in regulations that occur while applications are being processed. The Zephyrian team exchanged what appeared to be concerned looks. And, Oliver continued cheerfully, your system must be designed to work with existing government databases, which may or may not be compatible with each other, may or may not be updated regularly, and definitely don't use consistent formatting for the same types of information. Finally, Priya said, delivering the killing blow, you have 2 hours to design this system, and then you must successfully process 5 test applications using your system while a panel of neutral observers evaluates your process for efficiency, accuracy, and compliance with proper administrative procedures. Senior bureaucrat Tex Minar made a sound that the translator rendered as deep existential dread. Any questions? Margaret asked pleasantly. The human team immediately began working with the kind of coordinated efficiency that spoke to years of experience with exactly this type of impossible challenge. They had, after all, grown up in a world where someone, somewhere, had decided that the best way to handle the simple task of getting permission to do something was to create systems so complex that they required specialized training to navigate. Oliver started sketching out the basic application form, automatically including fields for information that might be required by any of 17 different government agencies, even though most applicants wouldn't need to deal with more than 3 or 4 of them. The key was to collect everything up front, because having someone come back later with additional forms was both inefficient and cruel. Priya worked on the review process, designing a system that would route applications to the appropriate departments based on a complex decision tree that took into account business type, location, size, customer base, environmental impact, and whether the application was submitted on a day ending in Y. She included multiple checkpoints where applications could be delayed for additional review, because experience had taught her that any system without built-in delays would be viewed with suspicion by the people who had to use it. Professor Williams tackled the appeals process, creating a 3-tier system where dissatisfied applicants could first request informal review, then formal administrative review, then quasi-judicial review by a panel of experts who weren't technically judges, but had the authority to make binding decisions that could be appealed to actual judges. David Kim designed the interagency coordination protocols, establishing procedures for handling situations where multiple departments needed to sign off on the same application, but their requirements conflicted with each other. His system included provisions for interagency meetings, joint review processes, and a special bureaucratic deadlock resolution procedure for cases where agencies couldn't agree on anything. Margaret Foster created the quality control and compliance framework, designing audit procedures that would ensure the system was working correctly, while simultaneously creating enough documentation to prove that it was working correctly, even when it wasn't working correctly. Meanwhile, the Zephyrian team was approaching the problem with the kind of logical, efficient thinking that had probably served them well in most situations, but was proving to be a significant handicap when dealing with human-style bureaucracy. We should create a simple, streamlined process, suggested Combat Administrator Zixkar. Single application form, clear review criteria, straightforward approval or denial. That makes sense, agreed Data Coordinator Yex Theta. We can eliminate redundant steps and create efficient workflows. We should use automated systems wherever possible to reduce processing time and eliminate human error, added Protocol Specialist Kextonis. Watching them work, Oliver felt almost sorry for them. They were trying to create a system that would actually work well, which completely missed the point of human bureaucracy. Time, announced the head arbitrator after exactly 2 hours. The Zephyrian team presented their system first. It was, Oliver had to admit, quite elegant. A single comprehensive application form that collected all necessary information in a logical order. A review process that routed applications to appropriate specialists based on clear, objective criteria. Automated checks for completeness and accuracy. A straightforward approval process with clear timelines and expectations. Very efficient, noted one of the neutral arbitrators. Processing time appears to be optimized, with minimal redundancy and clear accountability measures. Thank you, said senior bureaucrat Tex Minar, sounding relieved. Then the human team presented their system. Our application process, began Oliver, starts with Form AP1, which is the initial application form. However, applicants must first complete Form PR3 to determine which version of Form AP1 they need to use. There are multiple versions of the application form? Asked the head arbitrator. 17 versions, Priya confirmed, depending on business type, location, and the phase of the moon. Well, not actually the phase of the moon, but there is a seasonal variation based on whether the application is submitted during fiscal quarters that end with odd-numbered months. Once the correct application form is completed, continued David Kim, it goes through our preliminary review process, where we check for completeness. Applications that are missing information are returned to the applicant with Form IR7, which explains what additional information is needed, and provides Form AP1S, which is the supplemental information form. Applications that pass preliminary review, added Professor Williams, are then forwarded to the appropriate departments for substantive review. However, the routing process itself requires completion of Form RT12 by the preliminary review officer, who must determine which departments have jurisdiction based on criteria established in Regulation 47B, which is currently under review and may be changed at any time. During the review process, Margaret explained, each department fills out Form DR8 documenting their findings. If all departments approve, the application is approved. If any department has concerns, the application is forwarded to the Interagency Coordination Committee, which meets every third Tuesday to review problematic applications. What if the application is time-sensitive? Asked one of the arbitrators. Applicants can request expedited processing by filing Form EP4, Oliver replied, which requires an additional fee and must be accompanied by Form JS2, which documents the justification for expedited processing. Expedited applications are processed within 30 days instead of 60 days, unless they require interagency coordination, in which case the expedited timeline is 45 days, unless the Interagency Coordination Committee needs to schedule additional meetings. The neutral arbitrators were staring at them with what Oliver was pretty sure was a mixture of horror and fascination. How long does a typical application take to process? Asked the head arbitrator. That depends on how you define typical, Margaret replied cheerfully. Simple applications with no complications usually take 60 to 90 days. Applications requiring interagency coordination average 4 to 6 months. Applications that get appealed can take anywhere from 8 months to several years, depending on how many times they bounce between different review bodies. And applicants accept this? They don't have a choice, David explained. If they want the permit, they have to go through the process. Besides, we've found that making the process difficult helps ensure that only people who really need the permits apply for them. That is, the head arbitrator paused, apparently searching for words. That is either brilliant or insane. Why not both? Oliver suggested. Chapter 10. The Judgment of Bureaucratic Excellence. The final test of both systems came when each team had to process 5 sample applications using their newly designed bureaucratic frameworks. This was where the rubber met the road, where theoretical bureaucracy became practical bureaucracy, and where the Zephyrians learned the true horror of human administrative systems. The applications themselves were deviously crafted by the human team to represent real-world scenarios that would test any bureaucratic system to its limits. There was a seasonal business that operated in 3 different jurisdictions, with different environmental regulations. A small manufacturer that was also a retail operation that also provided services, making its classification deliberately ambiguous. A business that employed family members, contract workers, and part-time employees, each of which fell under different regulatory frameworks. A non-profit organization that also engaged in commercial activities. And, as a special treat, a business that had started operations before applying for permits and was now trying to become legal retroactively. The Zephyrian team approached these applications with their characteristic logical efficiency. They processed each application systematically, made decisions based on their clear criteria, and completed all 5 applications in 43 minutes. Very impressive, noted one of the arbitrators. All applications processed correctly according to the established procedures, with clear documentation and efficient use of time. The human team took a different approach. They spent the first 20 minutes just reviewing the applications and making notes about potential complications. Oliver identified 14 different regulatory issues that would require interagency coordination. Priya flagged 6 applications that would need supplemental information. David noted that 2 applications might require environmental impact assessments. Professor Williams found 3 applications that could potentially be subject to expedited processing requests. Margaret discovered that 1 application might qualify for a retroactive legalization process that hadn't been used in 15 years, but was still technically available. Then they began processing the applications. Application 1 went smoothly until they reached the part where the seasonal business operated in multiple jurisdictions. This triggered the Interagency Coordination Protocol, which required scheduling a meeting between representatives from 3 different departments. Since this was a simulation, they scheduled an imaginary meeting for next Tuesday, put the application on hold, and sent Form IC-7 to the applicant explaining the delay. Application 2 seemed straightforward until they realized that the business classification was ambiguous. This required the applicant to be contacted for clarification, which meant sending Form CI-12 requesting additional information. The application was put on hold pending the response. Application 3 triggered a requirement for environmental review because the business involved manufacturing, even though the manufacturing was on a very small scale. This meant forwarding the application to the Environmental Assessment Division and waiting for their review, which would take 30 to 45 days. Application 4 fell into a regulatory gray area because it was both a nonprofit and a commercial enterprise. This required consultation with the Tax Classification Review Board, which would need to schedule a hearing to determine the proper classification. Application 5, the business trying to become legal retroactively, required use of the Retroactive Compliance Protocol, which hadn't been updated since 2008 and required approval from the director's office. At the end of their allotted time, the human team had fully processed exactly 0 applications, but had initiated proper procedures for handling all 5 according to the appropriate regulatory frameworks. "I don't understand," said Commander Vexthara. "You did not approve any of the applications." "That's correct," Margaret replied proudly. "But we processed them all correctly according to proper administrative procedures." "But the applicants do not have their permits." "Not yet," Oliver agreed. "But they're all in the system now, and they'll be processed according to the appropriate timelines and procedures." "When will they receive their permits?" "That depends on how quickly they respond to requests for additional information, and whether any of the reviewing agencies have concerns," Priya explained. "Assuming everything goes smoothly, probably sometime in the next 4 to 8 months. 4 to 8 months? For the simple ones," David clarified. "The retroactive compliance case could take up to 3 years depending on how many appeals are filed." The neutral arbitrators conferred among themselves for several minutes. Oliver watched them with interest, wondering if any of them had ever encountered anything quite like human bureaucracy before. Finally, the head arbitrator returned to announce their decision. "This has been an educational experience," it began. "The Zephyrian team demonstrated superior efficiency, logical thinking, and practical problem-solving. Their system would undoubtedly serve the needs of applicants more effectively." Oliver's heart sank. They had lost. Earth was going to be conquered by efficient aliens with sensible administrative procedures. However, the arbitrator continued, the competition was to demonstrate superior mastery of bureaucratic processes, not to create superior bureaucratic processes. In this regard, the human team has demonstrated a level of bureaucratic sophistication that is, frankly, terrifying. "The human system," added another arbitrator, "represents bureaucracy elevated to an art form. It is simultaneously functional and dysfunctional, efficient and inefficient, helpful and obstructive. It embodies the paradoxical nature of bureaucracy itself. Moreover," said the third arbitrator, "the human team's approach to these applications demonstrates masterful understanding of bureaucratic principles. They prioritized process over results, procedure over efficiency, and documentation over speed. This is bureaucracy in its purest form. Therefore," announced the head arbitrator, "we declare the human team the winner of this competition." The silence that followed was broken by what sounded like several Zephyrians trying very hard not to make any noise that might be interpreted as relief. Chapter 11. The Sweet Taste of Administrative Victory. The aftermath of humanity's bureaucratic triumph was, appropriately enough, buried in paperwork. The Zephyrians, true to their word and the ancient treaty, began the process of withdrawing from Earth's vicinity, but not before filing the proper departure documentation with the appropriate galactic authorities. "I have to admit," said Commander Vexthara during the formal withdrawal ceremony, "I am impressed by your species' dedication to administrative complexity." "Thank you," replied Priya, who was still glowing from their victory. "We've had a lot of practice." "I do have one question, though," Vexthara continued. "How do you actually accomplish anything with such elaborate procedures?" "Very slowly," Oliver answered honestly. "But the thing about bureaucracy is that it's not really designed to make things happen quickly. It's designed to make sure that when things do happen, they happen the right way, according to the proper procedures, with appropriate documentation and oversight." "And people accept this?" "People complain about it constantly," Margaret Foster said with a smile. "But they also understand that the alternative, having no procedures at all, would be chaos. Bureaucracy might be slow and frustrating, but it's also fair and predictable. Everyone has to follow the same rules." "Well, mostly the same rules," David Kim added. "There are exceptions for certain circumstances, which are documented in Regulation 15C, subsection 4, unless the circumstances fall under the provisions of Executive Order 2019-A, which modified the exception procedures for applications filed during odd-numbered years." Vexthara made that untranslatable noise again. "I think I understand why your species was granted protected status under galactic law." "Oh?" Priya asked. "Any species capable of creating bureaucracy this sophisticated is clearly too dangerous to be allowed to spread throughout the galaxy unsupervised." Oliver wasn't entirely sure if that was a compliment or not, but he decided to take it as one. The formal withdrawal took another 6 hours to complete, partly because the Zephyrians had to file departure requests with 3 different Earth agencies, and partly because nobody could find the right forms for alien military force withdrawal procedures. In the end, they used the forms for foreign military exercise conclusion, which were close enough and only required 17 different signatures. As the last Zephyrian ship disappeared into the depths of space, Oliver found himself standing on the observation deck of the UN building, looking up at stars that suddenly seemed a lot more friendly than they had a week ago. "So," said Priya, joining him at the window, "what do we do now?" "Now?" Oliver grinned. "Now we file a report on the entire incident, in triplicate, with supporting documentation, and we'll probably need to establish a new department to handle future alien contact situations." "How long do you think that will take?" "To establish a new government department? With proper oversight and accountability measures?" Oliver considered this seriously. "Probably about 2 years, assuming we don't run into any major bureaucratic complications. And if we do run into complications, then it could take significantly longer. But that's okay. We've got 73 years before the Zephyrians can try to conquer us again." "Plenty of time to get the paperwork sorted out." Margaret Foster appeared beside them, carrying a stack of forms that was roughly the size of a small phone book. "Speaking of paperwork," she said cheerfully, "I need everyone to fill out Form AAR-15 documenting your participation in the competition, and Form XC-7 for the overtime authorization, and Form SI-22 for the security clearance review." And Oliver and Priya looked at each other and started laughing. "You know what?" Oliver said. "I think we're going to be just fine." Epilogue: The Bureaucratic Legacy. 3 months later, Oliver received a message through the newly established Galactic Communications Protocol, which had required 47 different forms to set up an approval from 6 different agencies, 3 of which hadn't existed when the process started. The message was from Commander Vexthara. "Dr. Hartwell," it read, "I thought you might be interested to know that news of humanity's bureaucratic capabilities has spread throughout the hegemony. We have received 17 formal requests from other species asking for guidance on how to establish more effective administrative procedures. Additionally, 12 different planets have formally requested that Earth provide consulting services to help them improve their governmental efficiency. I have been asked to inquire whether your species would be interested in sharing its bureaucratic expertise with the wider galactic community. There would, of course, be appropriate compensation for such services. Please let me know if this is something your government would be willing to consider." I should mention that the formal request process requires completion of Forms GC1 through GC47, which I have attached to this message. With sincere respect for your administrative capabilities, Commander Vexthara. Oliver forwarded the message to Priya, who forwarded it to Margaret, who forwarded it to the newly established Department of Interstellar Administrative Affairs, which had taken only 18 months to create, a new record for federal agency establishment. 6 months later, Earth's first galactic bureaucracy consulting service was officially launched, After completing all required environmental impact assessments, interagency coordination protocols, and permit applications, the universe, it turned out, had a lot to learn about the fine art of getting absolutely nothing accomplished in the most complicated way possible. And humanity was more than happy to teach them. After all, it's what they did best. The end. Author's note: no aliens were permanently harmed in the making of this bureaucracy, though several may have developed a lasting appreciation for efficient government systems. All forms mentioned in this story are fictional and should not be used for actual administrative purposes. Side effects of reading this story may include increased appreciation for simple procedures, mild paranoia about government paperwork, and an inexplicable urge to organize filing cabinets. If you experience persistent bureaucratic nightmares, consult your local government office. They probably have a form for that.